Hello, sophomores. All right. Let me know how the audio quality sounds on this video. I'm trying to be better and make sure you can hear me better. I still haven't found the lapel mic that I used in the spring when I was recording videos for you last spring during lockdown. This week, you're going to continue reading through the handout on the Roman Empire and the Principate and the early Roman emperors. So I'm not going to give long 30-minute lectures via video, but an occasional shorter video or a couple short videos I think can offer some helpful analysis. Your handout covers a lot of the biographical events of the emperors, and that's really important and helpful. I want these videos to complement that by offering some bigger, high-level commentary, so to speak. So for today, we're going to talk about the Principate Empire and Roman historiography is your first term. So I'll let you write that down. Roman historiography, remember, that's, historical schools of thought, or the study of history, historians. So first off, what do we want to talk about? Well, we have the Principate, which refers to this first period of the empire. And that's usually dated something like 27 BC to 180 AD. The endpoint's a little squirrely. You could date it differently if you want, but this works for the most part. So it's a good 200 years. And so this is a period where you have a princeps, emperor. He claims to be first citizen. And you have sort of the fiction or the illusion of the republic. That the republic is still alive. We're sort of pretending that the republic still exists. You still have a senate, they still have consuls and elections and assemblies pass laws, and then the princeps is the manager on top of all of this. Okay. Now, our history for this period is a little tricky. On the one hand, we're dealing with some of the most famous Roman historians. And what I mean by this, of course, is, how much do we know about this period and how do we know about it? Who are our sources, right? So our sources are some of the most famous Roman historians. Especially for the first century, the two biggest names are Tacitus and Suetonius. Tacitus writes a history called the Annals. It's a very famous history of much of the first century. Suetonius writes a series of biographies. There's 12 of them, the lives of the 12 Caesars. It was basically the first 12 emperors, actually going back to Julius Caesar as well. So Suetonius is really useful for biographical information. Tacitus gives us more of a political narrative. He talks about some very famous events like the Civil War after Nero, the conquest of Britain, the end of Domitian, and some of those sorts of things. And so this is where we get a lot of our really famous narratives about Roman emperors. When you think of Roman history, people like to think of, maybe they think of the Republic, but often they think of gladiator fights and megalomaniac, crazy Roman emperors. I'll bet many of you have heard of names like Caligula and Nero. They're really infamous, and they're coming up. And some older periods in Western history, building off of these historians, have characterized, the Roman Empire as corrupt or decadent, tyrannical. Some of these Roman emperors can be pretty tyrannical, which can create a negative impression, right? We've lost the glorious liberty of the Republic. That was all good. Now we're in the Empire and things are bad. And especially many of these emperors are bad. So we have a picture, a narrative. Maybe I should have said narrative, that many of these emperors corrupt tyrants, right? And certainly it is true, the princeps, the principate, these were one-man rulers who ultimately did what they wanted. They were sometimes assassinated, but they did what they wanted, and some of them were quite interesting in their personal lives. Caligula really was quite a figure. Nero is pretty special, and not in a good way. But I do need to throw a grain of salt onto this and cast some doubt on this. Especially this is something modern historians who change the narrative somewhat. They're a little bit skeptical of some of this classic narrative, and while in some cases I think they might be wrong, I think there are others in which they point out some worthwhile things. For one thing, first and foremost, in the grand scheme of things, as we'll talk about in a minute, the Roman Empire as a whole does pretty well for these 2 centuries. There are a couple of civil wars, but by and large, things are nowhere near as bad as the previous period at the end of the Republic. There are many things that seem to go well in the empire. By and large, there's the Pax Romana. There's peace and prosperity. There are not a lot of foreign wars even, and those that you do have mostly are successful for Rome. Increasingly today, we have a picture of the Roman economy getting bigger and more prosperous. So, is it possible? Would it be a little bit odd if you had a bunch of corrupt, tyrannical Roman emperors, but the Roman Empire was actually doing pretty well? So one of the things modern historians would point out is that these Roman historians are mostly all aristocrats. They're senators. And so they tend to be writing history from the aristocratic perspective. I don't mean to say that they're completely biased, and that they can't be trusted. In many ways, Tacitus is one of the greatest historians of the ancient world. So I'm not knocking my boy Tacitus here, please. He's great. He has some of the best quotes in all of Roman history. But you do have to realize that they're coming from the perspective of the aristocratic elite. These are the Roman senators who are thinking to themselves, we used to be a republic and we've lost that liberty. When they're talking about liberty and losing liberty, this is often what they mean. We senators lost our liberty to run Rome. For average Joe Blow in the Roman Empire, things don't really change that much. Your average peasant homeowner or shopkeeper or merchant, his life hasn't really changed all that much. And if you're a slave, then it's not really any different. So when they talk about losing liberty, it's often more the senatorial class. And so just realize that they're telling history with a grain of salt. Sometimes these historians talk about emperors as corrupt and tyrants for killing senators. Sorry about that. Who were plotting in conspiracy with them or are against the emperors. And so in this case, this is senators writing about their own friends being killed by the emperors. Now, that sounds kind of tyrannical, doesn't it? Of course, from the emperor's perspective, it's look at these traitorous senators who are plotting to overthrow me. Of course I should be spying on them and trying to ferret out treason. And you also have to realize, so there's an aristocratic perspective, maybe even a bias. Also, maybe I should be giving you more notes here. So it's the senators writing the history. So it reflects an aristocratic perspective. Okay. And especially when it comes to some of the, shall I say, juicier details of some of the Roman emperors. It's quite possible and even perhaps likely that in many, I can think of some specific examples, that some infamous, famous stories about Roman emperors probably aren't true and that they were exaggerated or maybe even made up by historians. A lot of these stories sometimes amount to what we might call like a palace gossip. So, this emperor is doing corrupt and decadent things in his personal, he's having, wild decadent parties and carrying on with affairs and killing people. Well, how do we know this? Oh, well, I heard this. Someone told me. It's like, It's like if you try to follow politics today and you see exaggerations and stories blown out of proportion or reported without context, right? Especially given how partisan things are in Washington, D.C. these days. If you only read a history of recent America told from one party, right? I mean, frankly, either a Democratic-leaning history or a Republican-leaning history, you're probably not going to get the most factually accurate history, right? You know, yeah, I mean, I don't want to get too much into current events issues, but hopefully you kind of understand what I'm saying. So just realize that in some cases you're reading histories of these Roman emperors written by their own political enemies, by the Roman senators. And again, it's another thing to just always be in mind is, and this is one of the reasons why you should actually cultivate some skepticism sometimes. Scandal sells. Think about it. Which story do people want to believe? The fact that, the emperor went and appointed this guy and put him in power, and he ran this thing for the emperor for a couple of years, and then he was doing an okay job, but it wasn't perfect, and so they came to agreement, and then he went and took a job somewhere else. But, and then, the next year while he was taking up his new job, he got sick traveling to his new post, and he died. Sort of thing happens all the time, totally boring. So, do people want to read that story, or do they want to read the story about how, this person was secretly a friend of the emperor, and they were involved in a scheme together, and the emperor was paying him money to do under-the-table things for him. But then he turned on him and betrayed him, and so the emperor exiled him to some faraway place, and while he was traveling there, the emperor had him poisoned. Because I heard from Senator so-and-so that the emperor and this guy were heard arguing. Which story sells? People like those stories. People want conspiracy stories. That's more fun than just like, he was a boring guy, and sometimes he made the right decision, and sometimes he made the wrong decision. Sometimes historians are killjoys. You get a really big, fun, exciting story that's almost too good to be true, and then modern historians come along and say, yeah, I don't think so. Sadly, but importantly, oftentimes the truth is maybe more mundane and boring. But it can conceal deeper and more interesting and important things that are worth knowing about. So, sorry for that, but it's true. It's true. Okay, let me pause that, and I'm going to come back quickly and say one more short thing.